Today, we're going to be talking about local governments, specifically when it comes to local governments in Texas. And one of the reasons I think it's really important to kind of focus on local government is something a lot of people don't realize is the majority of people who focus on politics and government or voting in general tend to focus on national politics. Like they care about who their senator is or the president is or maybe their congress member, but very rarely do they pay attention to the people who are local to them, which is really unique and interesting because that's where they can make the biggest difference and what probably affects them the most in life. And yet they don't really seem to care. And even when told that, they still won't focus on local races or anything close to them, or even a state race. I mean, the majority of people don't even know who, besides their governor, they might know who their governor is, but anybody else in there, unless you're taking a class about it, they're going to have no idea who any of these people are. When it comes to an actual city, what's really important to understand is kind of how they come into being in the first place. I mean, most of us kind of live in an environment where it's already here. So it's not like we had to do anything to actually create a city in the first place, but they're created all the time. And so in order to create a city, there's generally two different ways of actually doing it. One is called the general law city, and the other one's called the home rule city. They're like the different types of cities and basically their legal rights. A general law city basically is a city that's governed by a city charter, which the state itself actually creates through its statutes. And the other one is called a home rule city, which is it's a city that's governed by a city charter that the local citizens created. So one is essentially the state saying this is going to be your city and tells you how you're actually going to do it. The other one is the citizens the citizens getting together and saying, we're going to create a city and this is how we're going to do it. And this is what our government's going to be and all the other kinds of things that kind of go with it. There are two ways of actually creating a city. The first one's called incorporation. And basically, this is how we see it kind of like as a municipal corporation, and it becomes a city. And so it's like usually they put their thing together, they get their whole process working, and it becomes a city. Well, the second process is kind of it seems like it's a little more dubious, but it's, a perspective of basically from a city to the area around it. So if like a certain area has grown up around a city, what sometimes will actually happen is the city itself, the bigger city, the entity, will then turn around and say, you're now part of our city. So the way a city is actually constituted of government is it has a different set of different kinds of governments they can actually use. One is called a council manager government, which we see quite a bit of. And the other is kind of the more traditional one, which people generally, they're used to seeing or thinking that that's actually how the process generally works. And it's called the mayor-council government. The council manager government is the voters elect the mayor and the city council. Sometimes the mayor will actually get chosen by the council itself. It all depends on the bylaws and how they've actually set that up. With a council manager government, because of the way that it actually works, the council is usually considered part-time because it's not a full-time kind of a thing. And what they end up then doing is appointing an administrator who literally becomes the city manager. Whereas the mayor-council government is basically the mayor is elected and the mayor actually runs the government, which, like I said, it's the more historical, obvious approach because people are generally used to that and most media tends to cover it if you see that sort of thing. Then there's a third one, which is called the commission form of government. And what this does is the voters elect every section of government. Usually this is put together by another outside entity, like during certain periods in our history when we had problems with local governments, the state government would then step in, or the federal government would step in and then say, you need to form your government this way, and what you're going to do is you're going to put these people in charge, and you create about 5 major positions, and these people would be elected by, these positions would be elected by the people. And that continues on for a while, and it's usually, it's it works pretty well until it finally gets a little corrupt on its own, and then it kind of falls apart. There aren't too many of these around anymore because generally they don't work too well, and people are generally not all that happy with it because they have a lot of problems actually getting accountability from their government itself. Because remember, if you're elected like this, and people generally don't pay that much attention to what's going on in the elections, these people can tend to do a lot of the things that they actually want to do. So the different kinds of systems that we have here for electing positions tends to kind of lead to the governments that we actually have. In Texas, we have the municipal election system, and so we have at-large election systems. So basically all the voters in the city, they elect the mayor and the city council members, which works pretty well. We've had a few problems where some of our leaders haven't been the greatest leaders in the world, and so we've had to deal with accountability issues. And the other type is called single member district elections, and that's where everybody's running for a specific position in a different area, and generally they're districts, and those districts are represented by each one of those people running. So we have different ways of actually electing them, and part of the interest about that, or part of the I wouldn't say concern, but part of the quandary on this is there's a lot of people who don't actually know how people actually vote, and just kind of show up and vote if they do, and that's about it. They don't really pay attention to the numbers and the generated system that's actually working in the background. And so what we generally have is what's called 3 different processes, which is called a cumulative voting system, where basically each voter has equal rights to the number of seats that are open in the election, or the preferential voting system, where you go in there and you decide, I like all these different people, but I like them in this particular order. And these are generally nonpartisan elections, which basically means you're not a Republican, you're not a Democrat, you're not an independent, you're basically the right person for the right job. The only problem with that is, as much of a great idea as that is over time, parties start to become part of the issue, and when somebody's actually running for a position, people generally know what party they're from, so they support them or they don't support them. Texas has a really unique kind of a situation, and we're generally a one-party state, so we don't tend to have both parties constantly competing with each other. We did have some major changes in our governmental structure and our political structure back in the 1960s, and it's kind of changed a little bit again in the 1980s, but generally it's the Republican Party's in charge, and tends to basically choose and pick people from within their party. One of the problems we do have in Texas, and I've probably mentioned this quite a few times already, is voter turnout. Well, think of it this way. This country, the United States, has very low voter turnout in pretty much all elections. Now, fast forward or take a look at that and go, wait a minute, what about like the state elections or the local elections? And you'll find, like I said in the very beginning of this little presentation, is people have a tendency to focus only on the national stage and don't focus anywhere on the local issues or the local stage. And so they don't care. And because they don't care, they don't vote. And therefore, our voting numbers run 10, 15% sometimes, which is really low, which means if you're voting for about 10 people, which is pretty sad when you talk about a democracy. So let's talk about our county government, because I've talked about our local government, but our county government tends to work kind of as an administrative arm of the state. Um, it's not like the federal versus the states, where the federal encompasses a certain amount of power and then the state encompasses kind of what's left over. Whereas counties actually serve as um, the arm, I kind of said that already, of the state itself to do all of the things that the state can't actually physically do itself. And so it tends to work out pretty well until there is jurisdictional problems. What also happens, because the county does serve the state this way, it doesn't provide urban type services, meaning for the cities themselves. And so those types of services have to generally be handled by the cities. And so one of the other types of governments we have within our local government system is called special district governments. And imagine like the bus service. And so like if you have a bus that needs to run across multiple cities, what'll generally happen is a multi-agency organization is created, or if there's one already, they'll go to that. But if there's not one already, what they'll do is they'll form a coalition between these different groups and create an agency, which is basically a government of itself. A good example of this is like in San Francisco with Muni, or BART. BART is probably a better example. BART, which basically serves the entire Bay Area, not one specific city. So it has to answer to so many different chiefs, but at the same time serve so many different subjects. One of the other governmental structures that exists within our system is school districts. Now, we're all familiar with them because we've all been in the school district, but at the same time, we may not understand how they actually work. And so without getting into the nitty gritty of it, they're usually run by a superintendent, and the people who serve as the superintendent's board are generally elected at large. That's pretty much all you have to know about that. So that basically sums up the idea of what we focus on when it comes to our local governments. It's not a whole lot to cover, but there's little specific pieces of information you might want to know. It's important because, like I said, the biggest problem we have in this country, and I think probably most countries as well, there's some others that do a lot better than this, is we focus nationally, we don't focus locally. But all of the issues that tend to affect you, that literally you could change and make a difference in your life, happen locally, and no one even pays attention.